When he touched me that first time, he stole my childhood. When he raped me after inviting me to his apartment, he stole my voice. When the abuse continued through 9th grade, he shattered my ability to love myself and trust others. Next Friday, I will stand in a courtroom and face my abuser. It's been years of healing from the trauma and the shame of what he did to me. I now feel ready to face him and tell him how what he did to me impacted my life. This and other things come from the impact statement that I will read in court. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge that what I'm talking about is a really tough subject. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys are sexually abused before they finish high school. Statistically speaking, that means that there are people in this audience who are also survivors of sexual abuse. And to those of you who are, the first thing I want to say is, I'm sorry. The second thing is, please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. And to all of you, I want to explain that I'm here talking about this difficult subject because it's one that needs more conversation. Having these conversations is the best way to keep ourselves safe. We all know about the emotional impact of sexual abuse, but there's also a significant financial impact. In 2017, the CDC concluded that there are 25 million rape abuse survivors in the US. And over their lifetimes, it will take $3 trillion to care for them in the form of medical care, mental health, criminal justice response, and other less obvious costs. Nearly a third of that, $1 trillion, is paid for by you and I in the form of taxes. Sexual abuse impacts all of us. It's been quite a journey since when I was sexually abused, when I was a teen, to standing here with you today. I've learned a lot about shame, how tenaciously it clings, and how difficult it is to overcome. I've also learned about the power of healing, how long it takes, and how transformative it can be. And in the process, I've discovered work that has more meaning and purpose than I could have ever imagined. I now work with schools, the very place where my abuse took place. And in the process, I've also realized how applicable that work is in our families and in our communities. I have spent my life since he abused me trying to reclaim what he stole from me, trying to scrub the shame that seeped into every thought as I tried to process who I was. Before he stole my childhood and my voice and burdened me with the shame that suffocated me, I looked to older adults to help me understand life and how to navigate it. After he repeatedly raped me, I didn't trust adults to care for me. I avoided people in positions of authority. In fact, I actively passed up opportunities to become a leader because leaders to me were not trustworthy. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey today. And in the process, I hope to leave you with a sense of optimism and also some practical tools that we can all use to keep our communities safer. In 2016, I received a letter from Milton Academy, where I went to school. It asked anyone who was a victim of sexual violence while they were at the school to tell them about it. There was no part about me that wanted to respond to that letter. I came up with all kinds of excuses. I didn't want my preteen girls to read about it in the news. I was in the process of starting a business. My wife and I were taking a trip. All of these responses came from shame. The shame of wondering what people would think of me if they knew I didn't stop it. I knew intellectually that it wasn't my fault, but I still held that shame. When he raped me, he turned me into a self-doubting shame machine. At a time I should have been thriving, I believed I was a vulnerable kid who didn't have much to offer the world. I spent the majority of my life since he abused me rewiring the connections in my brain to silence the constant litany of critical voices. But they still creep in from time to time, and I blame him for that. I spent the majority of my time in therapy examining shame. Shame is debilitating. It creates a doom loop that feels impossible to stop. It made me feel worthless and voiceless and hard to trust others. At a time in my life where I was looking for evidence that I had something to offer the world, my confirmation bias was giving me lots of feedback that I was always coming up short. I engaged in self-sabotaging behavior. I smoked pot and did drugs while I should have been studying for a test. When I didn't do well on the test, that confirmed that I wasn't very smart. When I didn't have clear direction in my career, that confirmed that I was aimless. When I got laid off from a job, that confirmed that I was an imposter and I didn't deserve that job anyway. All of these responses come from shame. When I got that letter from Milton, I realized how much shame I still held in my psyche, how much still remained in my bones. And the crazy thing is, I thought therapy left me in a pretty good place. Today, I still come face to face with residual shame. I have an opportunity to talk about the fact that I'm a survivor of sexual abuse in my work with schools reducing and responding to sexual abuse. Recently, a colleague of mine, Amy, asked me why she often hears about the first half of my story, but I rarely talk about the second half. And as I thought about it, I realized that the first half of my story left me feeling proud. I spent the majority of an evening fending off unwanted advances from a trip leader that I was on. The next morning, I told two of my close childhood friends, and one of them, named Doug, confronted the trip leader. He apologized and said that would never happen again. I felt good about that experience because I actually did something about it. And I knew the story about Doug advocating for me was powerful. But I still held a lot of shame. In that story, though, I realized that instead of feeling like a victim, I felt like a survivor. And I was acting like one. The second half of my story, I didn't feel the same. I still held all of this shame because after what he did to me in the summer, I went to his on-campus apartment. He had offered to help me study for a test. I didn't know why I would go to his apartment after what he did to me that summer. I didn't understand power dynamics. And I held that shame. I realized that second half of that story, for me, made me feel powerless. I realize now that he had that power, and he used it against me. Instead of feeling like a survivor, I felt like a victim. Telling my story helps me process my shame. It helps me recognize where it still exists. Telling my story helps me examine it from a place of power instead of weakness. When I was able to understand that sexual abuse is more about power than it is about sex, it helped me understand how powerless I was, that it wasn't my fault. It was not my fault. When I got that letter from the school, I felt terrified on many different levels. I sat down to dinner one night with my wife and 2 daughters. My wife suggested that telling my story might be good for me. It might also help others. My daughters reminded me that speaking up was something that we taught them to do, and that my voice mattered. When I was able to reframe the thought of going back to the school, when I was able to think about using my story as a way for others to understand their shame and access their own healing, that felt motivating and exciting to me. It was with that motivation, that understanding, that excitement, that I went back to the school and I told my story. After a 9-month-long investigation, the school published their findings. After reading it, I felt a combination of relief, sadness, and anger. I felt relief because I wasn't alone. 17 others had been abused by the same man. I felt relief that I wasn't alone, but I also felt this palpable sense of sadness, knowing how many other lives he tore apart. I couldn't help but wonder how many others were unable to push through their own shame and tell their own stories. I also felt this incredible sense of emptiness, because I realized that I had this shared experience of trauma with so many others, and that shame kept us apart. Instead of building community through that shame, it kept us silent. Shame keeps us complicit. That's exactly what I was trying to avoid. I realized that this was an opportunity for me to identify that I was a survivor from the report. I created a post on Facebook and tried not to think too much about it. In fact, I immediately went to the gym afterwards so I wouldn't delete it. I came back and I saw that my feed had lit up. That confirmed my vision of being able to use my story to help others. And it inspired me to go back to my high school and identify for them ways that they missed, things that they missed of rebuilding trust with me during the investigation. It inspired me to start working with other schools to help them understand how keeping the survivor at the center of a sexual abuse incident was not only the best thing for the individual, it was the best thing for the institution. I started a nonprofit called Learning Courage. And since then, we've helped more than 8,000 students become safer from sexual abuse. And we're just getting started. In the process, I've also learned and been reminded constantly about how the work that we do is equally applicable in businesses and families and communities. We don't think twice about making sure our kids know how to cross the street without getting hit by a car, about how to floss their teeth. We need to apply that same commitment to keeping kids safe from sexual violence. In my work with schools, it's the adults who often get in the way of giving kids the information they need to stay safe. Talking about sex can be awkward. But the reality is it doesn't always have to be about sex. I mean, think about it. We've been living through a pandemic. We are confronted every day with conversations about consent. Can I get closer than 6 feet from you? Can I shake your hand? How about a fist bump? Do you mind if I take off my mask? Starting with conversations like these build trust over time, and then you can get into more consequential conversations. The fact is that our kids are learning about porn as early as 8 years old. If that's what they think intimate sexual relationships are, we need to make sure that they understand that's not true. We need to make sure as parents that we can have conversations with our kids and that they can come to us. That will make sure our families and our communities are safer. I feel safer today than any other time since disclosing my abuse, since my abuse itself. Talking with you has been a great step in that process. I can't get my childhood back, but I've been able to live through my children and experience theirs. It's taken years, but I've learned to love myself and build trusting relationships. And finally, after 42 years, next Friday, I will stand in that courtroom and I will reclaim my voice. Thank you.